All right, today we're tackling one of the weirdest and most fundamental vulnerabilities in all of modern computing, Rowhammer. And what makes it so wild is that it's not a bug in your software, it's a flaw in the very physics of your computer's hardware.
So let me ask you a question that honestly sounds like it should be impossible. Can you actually change data inside a computer without ever accessing it, without opening the file, without having the password, anything? All the rules we know say, no way.
But it turns out there's this really bizarre flaw deep down in the hardware that says, yes, you can. And figuring out how is exactly what we're going to do.
To get our heads around this, let's use an analogy. Picture your computer's memory like a giant apartment building. Now imagine an attacker rents an apartment and they just start slamming their door over and over and over again, thousands of times a second. They're not breaking out or anything. They're just making a huge racket in their own legitimate space.
And you know what happens next, right? All that shaking, all those vibrations, they start to travel through the walls. And in the apartment next door, one the attacker has never set foot in, a picture suddenly crashes down off the wall. They managed to change something in a place they were never supposed to have access to. That, right there, is the core idea behind Rowhammer.
So let's go full-on detective mode and investigate this ghost in the machine. To figure out how this impossible crime actually happens, we've got to examine the crime scene itself, and that's your computer's memory, specifically its DRAM. So DRAM, that's basically your computer's short-term memory. It's this massive grid with billions of tiny little cells. Each one holds a tiny electrical charge that represents a single bit of data, a 1 or a 0.
See, for decades, the name of the game has been smaller, faster, cheaper. We've been cramming these memory cells closer and closer together. But here's the catch. The walls between them are now so paper thin that the electrical charges can actually start to leak and mess with their neighbors. They're just packed in way too tight.
Okay, so we have this little physics glitch. But how does that become an actual weapon? Well, this is where the hammer part of Rowhammer comes into play.
The attack itself is called Rowhammer, and you can think of it as, weaponized annoyance. A program starts hammering, just rapidly accessing the same rows of memory cells over and over and over. It's not even trying to read anything. It's just making a ton of electrical noise on purpose.
So let's look at how this plays out. An attacker hammers what we call the aggressor rows. Those are the ones in yellow. This constant electrical buzz puts so much stress on the row next door, the victim row in purple, that its charge starts to drain away. And eventually, poof, the bit flips.
And we're not talking about just a few times. The amount of hammering needed is just wild. We're talking about hitting those rows roughly 139,000 times.
And doing that fast is enough to cause a bit in a row you never even touched to just flip. A 0 becomes a 1. A 1 becomes a 0. And that tiny single change, that's all an attacker needs to get their foot in the door. And in 2015, this whole thing went from being a weird academic theory to an, oh no, this is really bad kind of problem. Google's elite security team, Project Zero, showed how they could use these bit flips to get kernel privileges. And trust me, that's like getting the master keys to the entire system. Game over.
Yeah, so once that happened, it kicked off this massive arms race. On one side, you have the hardware makers scrambling to build defenses, and on the other, you have researchers and attackers finding clever new ways to smash right through them.
Okay, look at this timeline. It shows just how fast things got out of hand. 2015, Google proves it's possible. Just 1 year later, DRAMmer is rooting Android phones. By 2020, even the newer DDR4 memory, with its supposed fixes, gets bypassed by an attack called trespass. And it just keeps going. As recently as 2024, Zenhammer showed that even the latest DDR5 memory in modern AMD systems is still vulnerable. The attackers are absolutely keeping up.
And this right here, this is the perfect picture of that cat and mouse game. The defenders come up with something like target row refresh, or TRR. So the attackers invent many-sided hammering to get around it. The defenders add another layer. The attackers build a tool, seriously nicknamed Blacksmith, that literally forges new attack patterns automatically. For every wall they build, the attackers just find a new ladder. So here's the bottom line, and it's a little scary. Even with all these new defenses like TRR built right into the hardware, researchers just keep finding ways around them. This problem is not solved, not by a long shot.
So you might be thinking, okay, that's a neat tech trick, but why does this really matter to me? Well,
It matters because it hints that the very foundation we've built our digital world on might have a crack in it.
Let's just quickly recap why Rowhammer is so uniquely scary. First off, this isn't a software bug you can just patch away. It's baked into the physical hardware. Second, it completely sidesteps our normal security, like blowing past the locked door. This lets an attacker escalate their privileges, basically going from a nobody to the person with total control. And it affects pretty much everything we use: laptops, servers, your smartphone. But here's the real kicker. The problem gets worse as our technology gets better, because we keep packing those cells tighter and tighter.
And all of this leaves us with a really big, kind of sobering question. We're building our entire future on this idea of making chips smaller, faster, and more powerful. But what if, as Rowhammer seems to suggest, we're pushing the laws of physics so hard that we're actually building on an unstable foundation?